It's impossible to pinpoint exactly when the idea of 3D gaming first entered the popular consciousness. Pre-rendered 3D graphics were a common sight in video games during much of the early 90s, but they appeared in games with a definitely two-dimensional design. Even Wolfenstein 3D, which features the term right in its title, is a game that confines its action entirely to a two-dimensional plane. No jumping, no climbing, not even the ability to lift your gun muzzle up a single inch. When it comes to games that offer the player free movement through a fully three-dimensional world, on the other hand, we're on much firmer ground. This was a development that struck the mainstream of gaming culture in 1996, the year that gave us the likes of Tomb Raider, Quake, and Super Mario 64. There were lots of action-adventure games featuring combat and puzzle-solving before Tomb Raider, even going back to the Atari 2600 days. But Tomb Raider was the first to have the player exploring a truly three-dimensional environment of caves, catacombs, and temples. Quake leapt ahead of previous first-person shooters by actually keeping track of where its protagonist and enemies were along a vertical axis. And Super Mario 64 traded the straightforward linear stages of its predecessors for a series of expansive worlds full of challenges and secrets. Technological progress had changed the way games worked before, but the advent of 3D changed just about everything. Mechanics that had been awkward and unpopular in 2D games suddenly worked and became the foundation for entire genres, while previously successful game concepts became confusing in 3D, and sometimes broke completely. In this series, Making the Leap, we'll be examining the differences in design between 2D and 3D games, and the ways developers had to change their thinking in order to survive. Some franchises made the leap swiftly and gracefully, others stumbled right out of the gate and nearly collapsed. And some, of course, never really broke out of the 2D design mentality at all. But no matter what series you're talking about, the difference between 2D and 3D is a huge one. A huge one. Combat against on-screen enemies is a mechanic that dates back to single-screen arcade games from the mid-70s. Back then, combat was pretty simple. You pressed a single button to shoot bullets and moved a joystick around to dodge the enemy and its bullets. Simple doesn't mean boring, though. With a few modifications, this was able to stick around for more than a decade as arguably the single most popular design for both arcade and console games. However, it had one serious flaw. It only worked for single-screen games based on scoring points, like shoot-'em-ups. When platformers and other more adventure-y genres started to become popular, the whole focus of game design changed, and combat, instead of being the centerpiece of the game, was now just something the player did to get to the end of a level. Many 2D games, including some of the most popular franchises, de-emphasized combat and treated enemies like just another obstacle, not that much different from a trap except that they moved around on screen. Players often found it easier to avoid enemies in these games than to fight them, because fighting enemies wasn't the point. Platforming was. There were games that focused on combat, some with very elaborate controls and interesting challenges, but most of these harkened back to the old arcade days in terms of design, with basic single-screen or vertically scrolling levels, score counters, and other anachronistic features. A combination of interesting level design and interesting combat wasn't likely to happen without a radical change to the way games worked. The shift to 3D design was what ended up doing this. In 3D, combat, after a few crucial modifications, was a game mechanic with a lot of potential. 3D platforming, on the other hand, was awkward, and frequently not fun. Essentially, combat was able to step back into the limelight because the competition had fallen out of it. But there were several hurdles on the path to solid combat in 3D. To begin with, a lot of important things happen before the fight even starts. Let's take a look at a typical screen from one of the quintessential 2D platformers, Super Mario World. Mario here has more or less free movement in 4 directions. He can run to the left or the right, jump up, and fall down. Since Mario spends a lot of time dodging obstacles and enemies, the fact that his vertical movement is limited is an essential part of the game. It means that anything moving horizontally toward him is much harder to deal with than if it only moved vertically. To dodge this enemy, for instance, the player either has to make a well-timed jump, or fall and hope there's something to land on below. Mario also needs to do a lot of jumping to get from platform to platform, so careless players will often face a nasty choice between falling into a pit or colliding with an enemy. There's also one particular enemy, the Boo, that chases Mario around the screen, no matter where he is. Enemies like this force the player to think fast and move around a lot, sometimes pushing them into traps or other enemies. Because they're so intimidating, Boos tend to be used pretty sparingly, and are often the most difficult thing about the levels where they appear. The level design in Super Mario World is complicated, but the player's goal is simple. Get as far to the right as you can, hit as few things as possible, and don't fall into a pit. So what happens when you take this basic design and put it in a world with full 3D movement? Well, to be perfectly frank, it doesn't work. Take the traps and enemies, for example. In 2D, these take up a fair bit of screen space and are hard enough to deal with that either avoiding or destroying them is the essential challenge of the game. But in 3D, you can just walk around them with no risk at all. An enemy that moves in a straight line is a serious hazard in 2 dimensions. In 3, it's something you wouldn't even bother paying attention to. So enemies stopped moving in straight lines. In Super Mario 64, and most 3D games really, enemies usually act the way Boo's did in Super Mario World, chasing after you as soon as you come within range. Enemies with projectiles shoot at the player, not in a predictable pattern. As a result, enemy encounters in 3D games can often feel overwhelming, because you can't memorize how the enemies will move and attack. Instead, you have to move constantly yourself, so they won't be able to draw a bead on you. In general, it's a lot harder to comprehend what's going on at any given moment in a 3D game. In this screenshot from Super Mario World, all of the threats facing the player are immediately visible. Now look at this screenshot from Demon's Souls, a 3D game. Here's a question for you. Is the player safe right now? The answer is, who knows? Maybe an enemy is sneaking up from behind the camera, or maybe he's in the path of an arrow that you can't see because it's obscured by his body. And what's going on just above the player's head? Maybe a dragon is flying in from off-screen, getting ready to torch the bridge and everything on it. These are all things that are possible in Demon's Souls. In fact, they're all things that could be happening at exactly the same time. If you don't know in advance what's going to happen, a 3D game can catch you off guard in ways that seem totally unpredictable. Developers responded to this problem by giving the player control over the game's camera, so that a panoramic view of the level and its hazards would be available at all times. But another, less obvious response was the slow elimination of platforming challenges from 3D games. Early on, some developers tried to make jumping puzzles work in 3D, but these were almost always criticized for being too difficult and confusing. The new camera orientation had trained players to look at the world around them, not their characters' feet. And so, even though free movement in all directions was now a possibility, many developers ended up choosing to remove vertical movement from the equation for the sake of a smoother game experience. So you're exploring this great big 3D world, an enemy spots you and chases you down, and the fight begins. Now what? The combat system in an action game usually boils down to a process of trading blows with the enemy. You hit them, then back off while they try to hit you, then move in and attack again, and so on. More elaborately designed games will shake this up a little, for instance by letting you interrupt the enemy with a well-timed attack or dodge, or by providing alternative attack options that keep you out of harm's way. But even then, the sequence of attacks from both the player and the enemies give a game a sense of rhythm that says a lot about its atmosphere and how it makes the player feel. In some 3D games, Super Mario 64 being the most well-known example, most enemies die in one hit. This makes for a very fast combat rhythm, and also has the effect of making combat feel incidental to the game's overall design, because it happens so quickly. A Goomba isn't so much a challenge as a distraction that you have to keep in mind while you're dealing with the real challenges. The fact that Mario can actually take quite a few hits, especially compared with his previous 2D incarnations, reinforces the feeling that combat is both easy and not very important. If you combine this low enemy health with low player health, the result is a very fast, aggressive rhythm that demands the player's full attention. Most 2D action games followed this pattern. They could afford to, because it's easier for a player to notice and avoid sources of damage in 2D than it is in a 3D environment similarly packed with hazards. So most 3D action games instead choose to give both the player and the enemies a substantial health bar, slowing the rhythm of combat way down. Combined with intricate combat mechanics, this slow pace makes combat feel more important and central to the game's design. But pacing isn't necessarily the biggest difference between 2D and 3D combat. After all, many 2D games also feature large health bars and a focus on combat. What makes a game that looks like this all that different from a game that looks like this when it comes to combat? Well, let's take a look at boss fights from both games and examine some of the contrasts. The first one I notice is the distance the game expects you to keep from the boss. In 2D games, the player will tend to hover just out of reach, moving in briefly to cause damage and then retreating again. Most of these games will inflict damage if you so much as brush against an enemy, so avoiding enemies is just as much of a challenge as avoiding their attacks. In fact, it's not uncommon for a player to lose more health from bumping into the boss than from anything else. 2D can have this punishing mechanic without becoming unfair, because bosses in 2D games are often small compared to the size of the screen, have a limited assortment of predictable attacks, and generally move a lot slower than the player. Sure, you'll take damage if you run into them, but if you're playing right, you won't be running into them anyway. In 3D, it's just the opposite. Keeping your distance from Demon's Souls bosses, for instance, is actually quite dangerous, since most of them will target you with strong and difficult-to-avoid long-range attacks. Also, these guys are just way too big, and sometimes too quick, for you to keep out of their way. Instead, the winning strategy is usually to get right up close to them and circle around, never staying in any one place for too long. They won't damage you on contact, so this maneuver is less dangerous than it might seem, and ducking behind them is often the only reasonable way to avoid their long-range or area of effect attacks, particularly in extreme cases like the Tower Knight here. Another big difference is the number of enemies you're expected to deal with in a single encounter. Bosses in 2D games often summon smaller creatures to make things more complicated. This was such a basic mechanic that almost every game would have at least one boss fight like this. In some games you're expected to just avoid these minor enemies. In others you have attacks that can clear out a lot of them in one hit. Either way, in 2D, a screen full of enemies is something you can deal with. In 3D, on the other hand, a screen full of enemies is an absolute mess. Not only can you not see all these guys at the same time, but in any game with a targeting system, you can really only attack one at a time as well, at least in the sense of intentionally aiming at them. Want to get rid of all the mooks? It's going to take a seriously long time to do it when you have to whittle them down one at a time. Maybe you could try to ignore them and just focus on the boss. Well, that's easier said than done when they all hover around the boss and throw off your targeting every time you move. In 2D, summoning minor enemies is an interesting complication that makes a boss fight more difficult, but not overwhelmingly so. In 3D, even a little bit of this can make a fight tooth-grindingly hard, so most developers don't use it, and when they do, well, let's just say the results usually don't end up on anyone's list of favorite boss encounters. In general, 2D boss fights are about being in the right place at the right time, while 3D boss fights are more about doing the right thing at the right time. To make one final point, many 2D games don't give the player any way to block damage, forcing you to maneuver in order to avoid damage instead. It's hardly a stretch for a skilled player to take no damage at all in a 2D boss fight, and the rhythm is determined by how fast you can deal out damage. In 3D, the encounter is far more often a battle of attrition, with the player almost guaranteed to take some damage, and the major question being whether you can take the boss down before it takes you down. So far, we've mostly been going over the various qualities of combat, but my last point has more to do with quantity. The fact is that one of the most prominent changes to combat in the shift to 3D was just that there was a lot more of it, and it took a more central role among the mechanics of video games. The most prominent game genres back in the early 90s were platformers, turn-based Japanese-style RPGs, puzzle games, and scrolling shooters. Of these, only the last one featured combat prominently. Platformers were more about moving around, and fighting enemies in them was usually optional. Puzzle games generally didn't have combat at all, and in JRPGs, while there was a lot of fighting, it was more cerebral and less action-oriented. All strategy and no tactics, if you know what I mean. But when we move to the late 90s and onward, we see a whole new set of genres taking center stage. Instead of platformers, we have 3D action-adventure games like Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie. The turn-based combat of JRPGs is losing ground to more action-oriented Western RPGs with real-time combat. And the type of game destined to take the most popular spot away from platformers is the first-person shooter, a genre that's arguably all about combat. In one way or another, all of these major genres have a combat focus that earlier games often didn't. That enormous open world provided by 3D had to be filled with something, and other mechanics just didn't fit. Platforming was too confusing and clumsy, puzzles too slow and frustrating. And as for minigames, well, they tried that for a while, and let's just say I'm glad they stopped. The video game market today is one dominated by combat-focused games. You'll find combat taking center stage in almost any AAA release for consoles or PC, and even a lot of popular indie games as well. These games don't just have combat, of course. Puzzles, and even a certain amount of platforming, will sometimes take the stage to round out a game's appeal. But for the most part, these other mechanics are just bit players. Combat is the star. This video took me way too long to make.